Let's discuss the history of cannabis. It's a long one. Cannabis has been used since prehistory. 10,000-year-old Japanese pots are found to contain cannabis. For 5,000 years, it's been an important herb in Chinese medicine. Cannabis has been found in 2,500-year-old Russian and Chinese tombs. Cannabis, which originated somewhere in Central Asia, was an important herb on the Silk Road. In ancient times, both West African and Native American tribes believed that the cannabis herb was a gift from extraterrestrials. In the 17th century BC, the Egyptians were using cannabis for depression, and by the 13th century BC for seizures. By 1000 BC, Hindu Indians from the subcontinent were using cannabis during their worship service for meditation, spiritual enlightenment, and relaxation. The Hindu Indians recognized cannabis's usefulness in respiratory illnesses. These folk healers recognized its usefulness in fatigue and for insomnia, as a digestive aid, and even as an aphrodisiac. As we turn to the modern millenniums, in 200 AD, Chinese physicians were using cannabis and wine as a mixture for anesthesia. In fact, a Chinese surgeon was able to do appendectomies and internal surgeries by using the cannabis wine mixture to put their patients into a semi-coma. By 1578 AD, Chinese physicians were writing about using the cannabis for multiple conditions, including antiemetics, antibiotics, and treatment for bleeding and leprosy. By the 16 and 1700s, America was being settled, and both the European settlers and the slaves they brought were using cannabis. They brought the seeds, and a lot of it was being used extensively for growing hemp. Hemp was essential for the sailing ships, for the nets they had to make. It wasn't until the beginning of the 19th century, 1830, famous Irish physician, Dr. O'Shaughnessy, wrote several papers showing the medical benefits of cannabis that he had learned while stationed in India. In fact, he became a private physician of Queen Victoria, and she was famous for using cannabis for her menstrual cramps. By 1860, the Ohio Medical Society noted cannabis's usefulness in all sorts of conditions, including migraines and seizures, cough, inflammation, and postpartum depression. So why did cannabis come out of fashion? The answer is at the beginning of the 20th century, when big pharmacies started making medicines. Big pharmacy could use certain drugs to make medicine. They could use foxglove to make digitalis. They could use Peruvian bark to make aspirin. But they couldn't find any use to make a medication out of the cannabis root. And so they promoted it to be outlawed through the government. The two big acts that really started turning cannabis into an outlawed drug was the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act and the Narcotic Tax Act of 1914. In 1914, Massachusetts outlawed the use of cannabis entirely, and in 1928, the United Kingdom followed suit. The term marijuana came into use over cannabis as a derogatory term used by the American Drug Enforcement Agency to denote that all these Mexican immigrants were bringing in this dangerous drug that they called marijuana, and that's where the term marijuana developed. In 1929, the Narcotics Farm Act officially outlawed cannabis, made a criminal offense to have cannabis, and it created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics with its director, a very prejudiced, bigoted, and angry man named Harry Anslinger as his first director. And he used all his power to really stigmatize cannabis. He teamed up with William Randolph Hearst and his newspaper empire to promote all sorts of false stories about how cannabis promoted murderers. And of course, the Reefer Madness movie was very famous, produced under his institution at that time. It was really a one-man crusade, which dramatically and caused the outlawing of cannabis use in this country. Now, at the time, doctors were beginning to use narcotics for addicts, that is, like we do now with the methadone. Anslinger decided that this was really the wrong way to go, even though multiple scientific studies show that it was much more effective than criminalizing these people. And we know from prohibition how prohibition causes all sorts of issues, organized crime, increased outlawing, disrespect for authority. The same thing was true for the cannabis. Under Anslinger's authorization, tens of thousands of physicians were arrested for promoting the use of cannabis and narcotics, and thousands lost their medical licenses. And in 1937, Congress was meeting to decide what to do about cannabis, and they had hearings where dozens of doctors testified about the usefulness of cannabis as a medication, including the AMA. The AMA was a very strong advocate for not outlawing cannabis, but the popular opinion at that time overrode the scientific use, which of course is true to this very day. And in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, which effectively made cannabis totally unavailable and a criminal activity in all forms. 4 years later, in 1941, cannabis was removed from the American Pharmacopoeia and Formulary books. In the 1940s, an extensive research program was made about the uses of cannabis, and it was found that it had no potential for addiction and no potential for increased criminal activity, but Mr. Anslinger dismissed that report as nonsense and promoted further outlawing of cannabis. In 1951, the Boggs Act required mandatory sentencing for any cannabis conviction, and the 1956 Narcotics Control Act required even harsher sentencing for anybody caught using cannabis. Now, things began to change in the 1960s with the counterculture movement, particularly in the Vietnam War. A lot of soldiers were suffering from PTSD in Vietnam, and they found that cannabis was dramatically helpful in controlling their symptoms. And the counterculture peace movement took up cannabis as evidence that the government was unfairly persecuting a non-dangerous substance. However, most public opinion and the politicians were still against the use of cannabis. In 1970, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse and Prevention Act set up schedules of drugs, Schedule 2 of drugs that had a high potential for abuse but still useful, like morphine, Schedule 3, 4, and 5, Valium, and other medications that had some potential for abuse and addiction, but they felt that cannabis should be in the same schedule as heroin, Schedule 1, with no potential use, no medical use, despite all the evidence. It had a lot of medical use. They said it had no medical use and had a high incidence of addiction, which that wasn't true either. And in fact, by 1972, the Shafer Commission under Govenor found that there were multiple medical uses for cannabis, including they proved it was useful for arthritis and glaucoma and depression, and yet, despite this obvious evidence of use, the government dismissed that report. Which brings us to 1982 and Nancy Reagan's Just Say No and the War on Drugs by President Reagan, in which he commissioned $1.7 billion on fighting drug abuse in this country. His war on drugs was so effective that it went from 1980, we had 50,000 prisoners for drug abuse, and by 1990, that had increased by a factor of 8, almost 500,000 Americans in prison for benign use of drugs. Things finally began to change in the 1990s. In 1992, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors authorized the use of cannabis for certain medical conditions, including glaucoma, cancer, chronic pain, and most importantly, AIDS. At that time, San Francisco was undergoing a large AIDS epidemic, and it was found that cannabis was very useful in the controlling the pain and the anxiety and several of the other symptoms. So San Francisco Board authorized that, and a few years later, 1996, California Proposition 215 legalized the use of medical cannabis throughout the state. Which brings us to modern day. 19 states have legalized recreational use of marijuana. 27 states have decriminalized marijuana, so even if you're caught with small amounts, it's not a crime. In 37 states, 74%, almost 3/4 of all states, have legalized medical use of cannabis. However, it's still a Schedule 1 as far as the government is concerned, the federal government is concerned, and if you take cannabis across state lines or try to take on an airplane, you're still committing a felony. This has been Philip Levin with History of Cannabis.